Was it possible to buy a person's future and accidentally sell your own heart in the process? The auction house smelled of old leather and desperation that autumn evening in 1891. Gas lamps flickered against mahogany walls as London's elite gathered, their silk and satin rustling like whispers of judgment. But Marcus Thorne wasn't there for art or antiquities. He was there for something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. A solution. His fingers traced the edge of his pocket watch, a nervous habit he'd developed since his father's empire began crumbling. 3 months. That's all the time the board had given him to prove he could transform from the reckless second son into a man worthy of the Thorne legacy. Marriage to the right woman, they said, would signal stability, commitment, the kind of respectability that made investors open their coffers. The problem was simple. Marcus Thorne had never been in love, had never wanted to be, and had no intention of starting now. The solution walked onto the platform in a dress the color of storm clouds. Eleanor Ashford stood before the crowd with her spine straight as iron, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. She wasn't being sold, not exactly. Her father's debts had done that months ago. This was merely the formality, the legal transfer of obligation from a dead man to whoever could pay the price. £50 would clear the debt. 75 would include her modest dowry. 100 would grant her a cottage in the countryside, far from the whispers and the shame. Marcus bid 300 without blinking. The room fell silent. Even the auctioneer stuttered, his gavel frozen mid-air. Eleanor's green eyes found Marcus across the crowd, and for a moment, something flickered there. Not gratitude. Something sharper, something that felt dangerously close to recognition, as if she could see straight through his expensive coat and polished boots into the hollow space where his conviction should have been. He told himself it was a business arrangement, as his driver brought her to his townhouse that night. She sat across from him in the carriage, silent as a ghost, watching the London streets blur past. The contract was simple. She would play the role of devoted fiancée for 6 months, appear at his side during crucial business meetings, and charm the board members' wives. In return, she'd receive a generous allowance, her father's debts erased, and her freedom when the charade ended. No actual marriage, no legal binding, just theatre. Why 300? Her voice cut through the darkness between them, soft but unnervingly steady. Marcus adjusted his collar. The appearance of generosity is worth more than gold in my position. That's not an answer. He met her gaze, those green eyes that seemed to catalogue every lie before he even spoke it. Because no one else in that room would have let you keep your dignity. Something shifted in her expression then, a crack in the armor she'd worn so perfectly on that platform. And you think buying me preserves it? I think, Marcus said carefully, that sometimes we're forced to choose between bad options and worse ones. She turned back to the window, but he caught the ghost of a smile. Then we already have something in common, Mr. Thorne. The first 2 weeks passed like a carefully choreographed dance. Eleanor learned to take his arm at precisely the right moments, to laugh at his business associates' tedious jokes, to wear the expensive dresses he provided without showing how much she despised the necessity of them. She was flawless. The board members' wives adored her. The investors noticed his newfound stability. His father's old partner even clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You've finally become a man, Marcus." But it was the moments between the performances that began to unravel him. He'd find her in his library at dawn, reading philosophy texts in Greek, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. She'd debate with him over breakfast about labor laws and women's suffrage. Her arguments so sharp, he'd forget he was supposed to be the one in control. She played piano when she thought no one was listening, pieces so hauntingly beautiful his servants would stop working just to hear. Eleanor Ashford, he realized with growing unease, was not the desperate gentlewoman he'd expected. She was something far more dangerous. She was extraordinary, and she was wasted on this arrangement. "You're staring again," she said one evening, not looking up from her book. They were in his study, the fire casting amber shadows across her face. Marcus had been reviewing contracts, but his eyes kept drifting to where she sat curled in the leather chair, completely absorbed in whatever French novel had captured her attention. "I'm contemplating the return on my investment," he lied. She did look up then, and her smile was sad. "Is that what I am to you? An investment?" The question hung between them, heavier than it should have been. Marcus had built his entire life on calculated risks and measured returns. Everything had a price. Everyone had a function. But sitting there in the firelight with Eleanor looking at him like she could see the truth he was hiding from himself, he couldn't remember what the right answer was supposed to be. "You're—" He started and stopped, the words tangling on his tongue. "You're more complicated than I anticipated. And you," she said quietly, closing her book, "are far less ruthless than you pretend to be." The air between them felt electric, charged with something neither of them could name. Marcus stood, suddenly needing distance, needing air, needing anything but the way his heart was hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. "The autumn gala is in 3 days, he said, his voice rougher than intended. "The board will make their final decision after that. So we're nearly finished with our arrangement?" "Yes." Eleanor stood as well, and for a moment they were just two people standing in a room full of unspoken things. "And then I'll have my freedom," she said, but it didn't sound like freedom, it sounded like a sentence. "That was the agreement," Marcus confirmed, though something in his chest was screaming at him to take it back, to tear up the contract, to do something monumentally stupid. She nodded, started toward the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. "Tell me something, Marcus. When you bought me that night, did you ever consider that the price might go both ways?" Before he could answer, she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of lavender and the unsettling feeling that he'd just lost something he'd never actually possessed. The autumn gala arrived, dressed in golden leaves and false promises, and Marcus Thorne stood at the center of it all, watching Eleanor dance with a rival businessman's son, and wondering exactly when he'd stopped pretending. Retrite. The chandelier above cast fractured light across the ballroom floor, turning every couple into shifting shadows. Marcus stood at the edge of the dance floor with a glass of champagne he hadn't touched, watching Eleanor smile at something the young Pemberton heir had whispered. It was the same smile she'd given the investors last week, the same one she'd perfected for the board members' wives. Beautiful, practiced, utterly false. Except when she laughed at something genuinely amusing, her hand would flutter to her collarbone, just above her heart. A tell. Marcus had noticed it 3 weeks ago and couldn't stop cataloguing every time it happened. The real Eleanor lived in those small, unguarded gestures, the ones she didn't know she was making. "Your fiancé is quite the sensation," Lord Whitmore said, appearing at Marcus's elbow with the predatory smile of a man who'd built his fortune on other people's misery. "Tell me, Thorne, how did a man like you capture such a rare creature? A man like you." The words hung in the air, dripping with implication. Marcus knew what Whitmore meant. The gambler's son. The second choice. The one who'd needed to buy his way into respectability. "Persistence," Marcus said coolly, meeting Whitmore's eyes, "and the wisdom to recognize value when others overlooked it." Whitmore chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Value? Yes. I suppose at £300 she was quite the bargain." The champagne glass cracked in Marcus's hand. He barely registered the pain, the thin line of blood welling against his palm, the sudden attention of nearby guests. All he could see was Eleanor's face across the ballroom, the way her smile had frozen, how her eyes had found his in that moment of violence. She'd heard, of course she'd heard, Whitmore had made sure of it. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice like cut glass. He set down the broken stem and walked straight through the crowd, aware of the whispers following him like a wake of carrion birds. Eleanor met him halfway, her composure perfect, but he could see the tightness around her eyes. "Your hand," she said quietly. "It's nothing. It's bleeding." "Eleanor, dance with me." It wasn't a request. She took his uninjured hand and pulled him onto the floor just as a waltz began, her movement so smooth that to any observer it would look planned, romantic even. But her grip was steel, and when she looked up at him, her green eyes were blazing. "That man," she said softly, so only he could hear over the music, "is trying to provoke you. He succeeded. He wants you to fail tonight, in front of the board, in front of everyone." Her hand tightened on his shoulder. "Don't give him the satisfaction." Marcus pulled her closer than propriety allowed, feeling the warmth of her through the silk of her dress. "He called you a bargain, like you were a horse at market." "I was at market," she said, and there was something broken in her voice that made his chest ache. "Or have you forgotten? You were there. You made the winning bid." "That's not—" He struggled for words, for the right way to explain that somewhere between that auction house and this moment, everything had changed. "I didn't mean for it to become this." "What did you mean for it to become?" The question was a knife between his ribs, precise and devastating. What had he meant? A convenient arrangement, a business transaction, 6 months of theatre and then freedom for them both. But Eleanor in his library at dawn, arguing philosophy with passion in her eyes. Eleanor at the piano, playing Chopin like she was pouring her soul into the keys. Eleanor across the breakfast table, reading the morning papers and getting righteously angry about injustice in a world that had given her every reason to become bitter instead. "I meant," he said carefully, "to solve a problem. I didn't mean to—" "To what?" The waltz swept them past Lord Whitmore, who watched with undisguised interest. Past the board members who'd bet against Marcus succeeding. Past his father's portrait on the wall, stern and disappointed even in oil and canvas. "To care," Marcus finished, and felt something shift between them, tectonic and irreversible. Eleanor missed a step. Just one, barely noticeable. But Marcus felt it like an earthquake. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, the angle, the ulterior motive. She'd been looking for those things since the night he'd brought her to his home. But whatever she saw now made her breath catch. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't say things you don't mean. Not tonight. Not when everything is almost over, and I can almost pretend that none of this will leave scars." The music swelled around them, violins reaching for something beautiful and just out of reach. Marcus spun her, watching the candlelight catch in her hair, and felt something in his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. "What if I don't want it to be over?" She laughed, but it sounded like breaking. "You don't know what you want, Marcus Thorne. You've spent your whole life doing what other people demanded, trying to prove you're worthy of a name you didn't choose and a fortune you didn't earn. This arrangement was just another box to check, another expectation to meet. You're wrong. Am I?" The waltz was ending. Other couples were applauding, preparing for the next dance. Eleanor pulled away, but not before he saw the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes. "In 3 days, your board votes. They'll see that you've settled down, found a proper wife, become the man they wanted. You'll get your inheritance, your position, your victory, and I'll get my cottage in the countryside and enough money to live quietly for the rest of my life. We both get exactly what we bargained for. And if that's not what I want anymore, what? Then you're a fool," she said softly, "because wanting more than what we agreed to will only hurt us both." She left him standing there on the dance floor, and Marcus watched her disappear into the crowd with the hollow feeling that he'd just lost something infinitely more valuable than his father's empire. The next morning arrived wrapped in fog and regret. Marcus found Eleanor's note on the breakfast table, her handwriting precise and elegant even in farewell. Gone to visit my father's grave. Don't wait dinner. E. He crumpled the note in his fist and called for his carriage. The cemetery was ancient, nestled in the hills outside London, where the city's noise faded into birdsong and wind through yew trees. Marcus found her kneeling before a modest headstone, her dark dress blending with the shadows. She didn't turn when he approached, though she must have heard his footsteps on the gravel path. He was a good man, she said to the headstone, to the mourning to no one in particular. Terrible with money, worse with investments, but good. He used to read to me every night, Shakespeare, Donne, Byron. He said words had power, that stories could change the world. She touched the carved letters of her father's name. The debts came after mother died. He couldn't bear the grief, so he tried to spend his way out of it, bought things, made investments in schemes that promised miracles. And when he died, the only thing he left me was his name and the obligation to clear his mistakes. Marcus knelt beside her, ignoring the damp earth soaking into his expensive trousers. Eleanor, do you know what the worst part was? She finally looked at him, and her face was raw with emotion. Not the auction, not the shame of standing on that platform while men calculated my worth. The worst part was knowing my father would have been devastated. He loved me more than his own life, and his love became the chain that bound me. He would have been proud of you, Marcus said. Of your strength, your intelligence, the way you've survived something that would have broken most people. She smiled sadly. You don't survive something like that, Marcus. You just learn to carry it differently. She stood, brushing dirt from her skirts. Why did you follow me here? Because last night I said I cared, and you told me not to. But I can't stop, Eleanor. I've tried. Every morning I tell myself this is still just an arrangement, still just a means to an end. And every morning I fail a little more spectacularly than the day before. The wind picked up, sending leaves skittering across the gravestones. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, and Marcus ached to pull her close, to be the warmth she needed, but he forced himself to wait, to let her choose. What are you asking me? Her voice was barely audible. I'm asking, he said carefully, what you want, not what the arrangement says, not what makes logical sense, what Eleanor Ashford wants if money and debts and expectations and my father's board didn't exist. She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. A crow called from somewhere in the yew trees. The fog was lifting, revealing patches of sky the color of forgiveness. I want, she finally said, each word deliberate, to believe that something real can grow in soil poisoned by transaction. I want to trust that you see me, not just the solution I provide. I want... She turned to face him fully, and her eyes were fierce. I want to stop being afraid that the moment I let myself feel something true, it will be taken away. Marcus stood, closing the distance between them. I can't promise perfect. I can't promise I won't make mistakes or that my world won't try to destroy anything good I touch. But I can promise that you were never just a transaction to me. Maybe for the first day, maybe for the first hour, but not now. Not for a long time now. When? She asked. When did it change? He thought about it. Really thought. The third morning. You were in my library reading Marcus Aurelius, and you looked up and said something about how most men spend their lives being terrified of their own thoughts. You said it like you could see straight into my skull, like you knew every coward thought I'd ever had, and I realized I'd invited someone dangerous into my home, someone who might actually matter. Eleanor's hand found his, her fingers cold from the morning air. The board votes in 2 days. I know. If we do this, if we make this real, they'll use it against you. They'll say I manipulated you, that this proves you're not stable, not ready. You could lose everything you've worked for. Then I'll lose it, Marcus said, and meant it with a conviction that surprised him. I've spent my entire life trying to earn my father's respect, his legacy. But what good is an empire built on lies? What kind of man inherits the world and loses himself in the process? She was crying now, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. "You're sure?" "I've never been less sure of anything in my life," he admitted. "And somehow that makes it the first honest thing I've done in years." Eleanor laughed through her tears, the sound bright as breaking glass, beautiful as ruin. And then she kissed him, there in the cemetery where her father lay dreaming, and Marcus Thorne finally understood what it meant to choose something for himself instead of having it chosen for him. But neither of them noticed the figure watching from behind the cemetery gates, or the knowing smile that curved Lord Whitmore's lips as he turned away. Retry. The letter arrived on ivory paper, sealed with crimson wax, and delivered by a boy who disappeared into the morning fog before Marcus could ask questions. Eleanor found it on the hall table when she descended for breakfast, her name written in a hand she didn't recognize, but somehow felt she should. She broke the seal in the sunlight streaming through the dining room windows, Marcus watching over his coffee with the careful attention he'd developed since the cemetery. Since the kiss that had rewritten the terms of everything they thought they understood. The words were brief, devastating, precise as a surgeon's blade. "Miss Ashford, your father's debts were not his own. Ask Marcus Thorne about the promissory note dated March 1889. Ask him who truly owned your father's fate. Some chains are forged long before the auction begins." The paper trembled in her hands. Marcus was standing before she'd even lowered it, crossing to her with concern etched into every line of his face. "Eleanor, what is it?" She held the letter out to him, watching his expression shift as he read. Confusion first, then recognition, then something that looked dangerously close to grief. "This is a lie," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" "Eleanor, March 1889, 2 years before the auction. Were you involved in my father's financial affairs?" Her voice was steady, but Marcus could hear the fracture underneath, the hairline crack that threatened to split her open. He set the letter down carefully as if it might explode. "I need you to let me explain." "That's not an answer. It's complicated. It's a yes or no question, Marcus." She stood now, putting the breakfast table between them like a barricade. "Did you have business dealings with my father before that auction? Before you saw me on that platform and decided I was the solution to your problem?" The silence stretched between them, heavy as the grave they'd stood beside yesterday. Outside, London was waking up, carriages rattling past, street vendors calling their wares, the ordinary sounds of a world that kept turning even as Eleanor's was collapsing inward. "My father," Marcus said finally, each word carefully measured, "was building a railway line through the Midlands. He needed investors. Your father was one of them." Eleanor's hand found the back of a chair, gripping it like it was the only solid thing in a tilting world. "Go on." The investment was sound. On paper, it should have made everyone wealthy. But there were complications, delays, cost overruns. My father was furious, looking for someone to blame. Marcus moved toward her but stopped when she flinched. He called in the debts early, all of them. Most of the investors had resources to weather it, but your father didn't. Eleanor finished, her voice hollow. "And you knew. When you walked into that auction house, when you bid £300 like it was nothing, you already knew who I was, what had happened." "I knew your name," Marcus admitted. "I'd seen it on documents. But I didn't know you, Eleanor. I didn't know your father had a daughter until I saw you standing there." She laughed, brittle as winter ice. "And what a convenient coincidence. The girl whose father's life your family destroyed, available for purchase just when you needed someone to make you look respectable." She pressed her palms against her eyes, breathing carefully. "Was any of it real, Marcus? Or was this just another way for the Thornes to profit from the Ashford tragedy? That's not fair. Fair? The word exploded from her. You want to talk about fair? My father died believing he'd failed us. He spent his last months watching creditors strip our home bare, knowing his daughter would be left with nothing but his shame. And all of it, traced back to your family's railway and your father's impatience. She dropped her hands, and her eyes were blazing. Did you buy me out of guilt, Marcus? Was I some kind of penance? I bought you because I was desperate and stupid and thought I could fix my life with money. His voice was raw now, stripped of its usual polish. I saw your name on the auction list, and yes, I remembered it from my father's papers. And yes, I thought it was ironic, cosmic justice maybe, that an Ashford might save a Thorne after everything. But I swear to you, Eleanor, I didn't know it would become this. This, she repeated softly. What is this exactly? Love built on a foundation of ruin. A romance that started with your family destroying mine. Marcus moved around the table slow enough that she could retreat if she wanted. She didn't. I can't undo what my father did. I can't give you back those years or erase the pain. But what's growing between us? That's real. That's separate from everything that came before. Is it? Eleanor's voice broke. Or is it just another transaction? You assuage your guilt, I get financial security, and we both pretend the math isn't built on graves. Look at me. He was close enough now to touch her, but he kept his hands at his sides. What I feel for you has nothing to do with my father or his railways or guilt or any of it. It has to do with the way you read philosophy at dawn and argue about justice like you still believe the world can be fair. It has to do with who you are, not where you came from. But where I came from is who I am, she said. My father's death shaped me. His debts forced me onto that platform. Everything that I am, everything that brought me to you, is tangled up in what your family did to mine. We can't separate it. We can't pretend it doesn't matter. Before Marcus could respond, the door opened and Thomas, his valet, entered with obvious reluctance. Sir, Lord Whitmore is here. He says it's urgent and concerns tomorrow's board meeting. Marcus cursed under his breath. Tell him I'm not available. He anticipated that response, sir. He said to tell you that if you don't meet with him, he'll be sharing certain historical financial documents with the board. Documents concerning the Midlands Railway investment. Eleanor and Marcus locked eyes, and understanding passed between them like an electric current. Whitmore had sent the letter. Whitmore knew about the connection, and Whitmore was using it as leverage. I'll handle this, Marcus said. No. Eleanor straightened and something in her posture shifted. The vulnerability from moments ago crystallized into something harder, more determined. We'll handle this, together. Lord Whitmore was waiting in the study, examining the books on Marcus's shelves with the casual entitlement of a man who believed everything in the world existed for his appraisal. He turned when they entered, his smile sharp as a blade in the morning light. Miss Ashford, how lovely to see you looking so composed. I worried my letter might have caused distress. Your worry is touching, Eleanor said coolly, taking a seat without being invited, though somewhat undermined by the fact that you sent the letter intending to cause exactly that. Whitmore's smile widened. Direct. I appreciate that. It will make this conversation much more efficient. He moved to Marcus's desk, laying out several documents like a car dealer revealing a winning hand. The Midlands Railway, March 1889. Your father's decision to call in debts early. The subsequent ruin of 17 investors, including one Richard Ashford, whose financial collapse led directly to his death and his daughter's eventual auction. Marcus stepped forward, but Eleanor's hand on his arm stopped him. She was staring at the documents, her face pale but controlled. What do you want, Lord Whitmore? Want? I want what I've always wanted. The board seat Marcus's father promised me before he decided his wastrel son might actually be capable of leadership. He tapped the documents. Tomorrow the board votes on Marcus's future with the company. I intend to present evidence that his engagement to you is not a sign of stability, but rather a guilty man's attempt to atone for his family's sins. That he manipulated a vulnerable woman whose father his family destroyed. That he's as reckless with human lives as he was with his allowance. That's a lie, Marcus said. Is it? Whitmore's eyes glittered. You knew who she was when you bought her. You admit it yourself. The connection between your family and hers is documented fact. How it looks, Marcus, is all that matters, and it looks like exploitation dressed up as romance. Eleanor stood, and both men turned to her. She walked to the window, looking out at the garden where frost still clung to the roses, remnants of beauty trying to survive the cold. When she spoke, her voice was steady as stone. You're right, Lord Whitmore. About the facts, about the connection, about how it appears. She turned, and her green eyes were clear. But you've made a mistake. You've assumed I'm a victim in this story, a damsel who needs rescuing from the wicked Thorne family. You've assumed that knowing the truth will shatter me, send me running, prove that Marcus and I are built on lies. And you're saying that's not the case? Whitmore's tone was mocking, but something uncertain flickered behind his eyes. I'm saying, Eleanor continued, moving back to stand beside Marcus, that I knew there was a connection between our families. I've known since the second week I was here. I found the documents myself while organizing Marcus's father's old papers. The railway investment, the early debt collection, my father's name among the casualties. Marcus stared at her, shock written across his face. You knew? I knew. She met his gaze, and her expression was gentle. And I stayed anyway. Not because I was trapped, not because of the arrangement, but because I chose to. Because I realized that sons are not responsible for their father's cruelties, and the past, however painful, doesn't have to dictate the future. You expect the board to believe this? Whitmore's voice had lost its certainty. I expect the board to understand what you clearly don't, Eleanor said. That love, real love, is what happens when two people choose each other despite every reason not to. Despite history, despite logic, despite men like you who profit from keeping wounds open and people apart. She picked up one of his documents, examining it with academic detachment. You can present these tomorrow if you like, tell them the whole sordid story. But I'll be there too, Lord Whitmore, and I'll tell them that Marcus Thorne is the first person who ever looked at me and saw not what I'd lost or what I represented, but who I actually was. That he gave me back my agency when your world had stolen it. That he spent every day since we met trying to be worthy of something he didn't even know he wanted. The silence in the room was absolute. Outside, a church bell tolled the hour. Whitmore's carefully constructed leverage was crumbling in his hands, and they could all see it happening. The board won't care about sentiment, he said, but his voice was hollow now. Then the board, Marcus said quietly, will have to choose between you and me tomorrow. Between a man who uses people's pain as weapons and a man who's trying, however imperfectly, to build something better. He moved to the door, opening it in clear dismissal. I think we're done here. Whitmore gathered his documents, his movements stiff with suppressed rage. At the threshold he paused. You're both fools. Love doesn't conquer empires. Money does. Power does. Then I suppose, Eleanor said softly, we'll find out tomorrow which one of us is right. When he was gone, Marcus closed the door and leaned against it, looking at Eleanor like he was seeing her for the first time. You knew. This whole time you knew about the railway, about my father's role in yours dying, and you said nothing. I was going to tell you, she said. After the board vote, after you were secure, I thought. She trailed off, then laughed shakily. "I thought I was protecting you. Isn't that absurd? The girl you bought thinking she was protecting you. Why didn't you leave? When you found out, why didn't you walk away?" Eleanor moved to him, taking his face in her hands. "Because by the time I found those papers, I'd already fallen in love with you, and I realized something sitting in your father's office, surrounded by evidence of old cruelties. We're not our parents, Marcus. We're not their choices or their mistakes. We're what we make of the wreckage we're given." He kissed her then, deep and desperate, tasting salt and hope and the strange alchemy of two people deciding that the future could be different from the past. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing hard. "Tomorrow," he said, "everything changes." "Tomorrow," she agreed, "we find out if the world is ready for us." But neither of them knew that across London, in a dimly lit office that smelled of old tobacco and older money, Lord Whitmore was already composing a different kind of letter, one addressed to Marcus's estranged uncle in Manchester, the man who'd been written out of the Thorne fortune years ago and had been waiting decades for his chance at revenge. Retrite, the morning of the board meeting, arrived dressed in steel-grey clouds that pressed against London's rooftops like a weight. Marcus stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his cravat for the third time, his fingers clumsy with nerves he hadn't felt since childhood. In the reflection, he could see Eleanor sitting on the edge of his bed, already dressed in emerald silk that made her eyes luminous even in the dim light. "You're going to strangle yourself," she said softly. He dropped his hands, meeting her gaze in the mirror. "I keep thinking about what my father would say if he could see this. His son gambling the entire company on love. He'd call it the final proof of my unworthiness." "Then it's fortunate." Eleanor stood, crossing to him and taking over the cravat with steady fingers, "that we're not living for his approval anymore." She tied it perfectly, smoothing the silk against his collar. "We're living for ours." A knock interrupted them. Thomas entered with a telegram, his face grave. Marcus took it, feeling Eleanor's hand find his as he read. "Arriving London this afternoon. Stop bringing evidence of mismanagement. Stop see you at the vote. Stop Uncle Richard." "He's coming," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "My father's brother, the one who was expelled from the company 20 years ago for embezzlement. Whitmore must have contacted him." Eleanor read over his shoulder. "What evidence could he possibly have?" "I don't know. But if Whitmore brought him into this, it's nothing good." Marcus crumpled the telegram. "My uncle swore revenge when he was removed. He said he'd watch my father's legacy burn, and he'd dance in the ashes." "Then we prepare," Eleanor said simply. "We go through every document, every transaction from the past year. If there's something they plan to twist against you, we find it first." They spent the morning in Marcus's study, surrounded by ledgers and contracts, account books and correspondence. The sun tracked across the floor as they worked in focused silence, occasionally calling out discoveries, cross-referencing dates, building their defense against an attack whose shape they could only guess at. It was Eleanor who found it, buried in a folder marked miscellaneous expenses from 8 months prior. A series of payments, each for substantial sums, made to various creditors throughout London. The names meant nothing at first, just an alphabetical parade of businesses and individuals. But when she traced them further, following the paper trail through supplementary documents, a pattern emerged that made her blood run cold. "Marcus," she said, her voice strange, "these payments, they're all debts, other people's debts." He looked up from the railway contracts he'd been reviewing. "What do you mean?" "I mean you paid them, or someone using company funds paid them. Look." She spread the documents across the desk. "Wilson's haberdashery. That was where my father bought fabric. Berkshire Lending. He had a loan there. The Gramercy Club. He was a member before." She trailed off, her finger moving down the list. Marcus, these are all my father's creditors. Every single debt he left behind. Someone paid them in full. Marcus stood, coming around the desk to see for himself. His face went pale as he scanned the figures, the dates. This is impossible. I didn't authorize these payments. Then who did? They stared at each other as the implications settled over them like snowfall. If Marcus hadn't authorized the payments, if the company funds had been used without his knowledge, it could appear as embezzlement, misappropriation, evidence of the exact instability the board feared. But more than that, far more personal and devastating, was the question that neither wanted to speak aloud. Someone knew, Eleanor whispered. Someone knew about my father's debts and paid them off using your authority. Someone who wanted to help, or someone who wanted to create exactly this kind of evidence against you. Before Marcus could respond, Thomas appeared in the doorway again, his usual composure shattered. Sir, there are men here from the Metropolitan Police. They say they need to speak with you immediately regarding financial irregularities. The study suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing inward. Marcus looked at Eleanor at the documents spread between them like accusations, at the door where his valet stood waiting for instructions that would determine everything that came next. "Show them in," he said. The officers were polite but implacable, their questions precise as scalpels. Yes, Marcus recognized his signature on the authorization forms. No, he couldn't explain why he'd paid debts belonging to a man who died 2 years prior. Yes, he understood how irregular it appeared that company funds had been used for personal matters. No, he had no documentation proving he'd intended to repay the company. Eleanor sat silently throughout, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed. But Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her breathing. She was understanding, as he was, that they'd walked into a trap far more sophisticated than they'd imagined. "We'll need you to come to the station," the senior officer said finally, standing. "Just to make a formal statement, clear up any confusion." "The board meeting," Marcus said. "It's in 3 hours. I'm sure the board will understand if you're detained by a police investigation." And there it was, the elegant cruelty of Whitmore's plan. Marcus wouldn't just lose the vote through scandal. He'd miss it entirely, unable to defend himself, his absence taken as proof of guilt. The company would go to his uncle or Whitmore or whoever had positioned themselves to catch it when it fell. And Eleanor would be left holding evidence that looked like she'd been complicit in the scheme from the beginning. "I'll come with you," Eleanor said, standing. "Miss, that's not necessary." "I insist." Her voice had the steel in it that Marcus had first heard in the auction house, the iron core that had let her survive everything the world had thrown at her. "If Marcus is making a statement, I want to be present." The police station smelled of carbolic soap and desperation. They were shown to a small room with barred windows, given tea that grew cold while they waited, told repeatedly that the inspector would be with them shortly. An hour passed, then 2. Marcus watched the clock on the wall tick toward the board meeting time, each minute a nail in the coffin of everything he'd worked for. "This is deliberate," Eleanor said quietly. They were alone except for a constable stationed outside the door. "They're stalling until the vote is over. I know. There has to be something we can do. Someone we can contact." Marcus shook his head. "Whitmore has thought of everything. Even if we could get a message out, even if someone believed us, by the time we're released, it will be too late." Eleanor stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The glass was thick, distorting the street beyond into wavering shapes. "I can't let this happen. I can't let them destroy you because of me, because of some twisted attempt to pay my father's debts. You didn't do this, didn't I?" She turned, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "If you'd never met me, if you'd chosen any other woman from any other family, none of this would be happening. You'd be at that meeting right now, confident and prepared. Instead, you're here, trapped in a room while men decide your fate, all because you were foolish enough to care about the girl whose father you helped ruin. Eleanor, I should testify, she said suddenly. I should go to the board myself, tell them everything. About the arrangement, about what we found, about Whitmore's manipulation. At least then you'd have someone speaking for you. Marcus crossed to her, taking her shoulders gently. And what will you tell them? That I paid your father's debts without knowing it? That someone used my authority to commit fraud? That the woman I'm supposedly engaged to has been living in my house for months, perfectly positioned to manipulate me? He touched her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. They'll assume the worst. About both of us. Then what do? We wait, Marcus said, though the word tasted like surrender. We wait, and we trust that the truth has some value left in this world. But even as he said it, the clock struck 4, and they both knew the board meeting had begun without him. At the Thorne Company headquarters, in an oak-paneled room that smelled of old leather and older money, 12 men sat around a mahogany table while rain began to patter against the windows. Lord Whitmore stood at the head, a stack of documents before him, his expression grave with false regret. Gentlemen, I'm afraid we must begin without Mr. Thorne. As you know, he's currently detained by the police regarding serious financial irregularities. He paused, letting the murmurs of shock ripple through the room. I take no pleasure in bringing this matter before you. But as board members, as guardians of this company's integrity, we have a duty to examine evidence of misconduct, regardless of the perpetrator's name. He began distributing the documents, each one a piece of the puzzle that painted Marcus as either incompetent or corrupt. The payments to Richard Ashford's creditors, the engagement to the dead man's daughter, the connection between the Thorne family's railway disaster and Eleanor's father's ruin. Laid out in black ink and cold facts, it looked damning. I propose, Whitmore said, that we vote today not on Marcus Thorne's readiness to lead, but on whether he should be removed from consideration entirely. And I further propose that Richard Thorne, Marcus's uncle, be reinstated to the company and given the position we're here to decide. The door at the back of the room opened, letting in a gust of wet wind and an old man in a traveling coat. Richard Thorne had his brother's eyes, but where the elder Thorne had wielded power with certainty, the younger had the look of a man who'd spent decades nursing grievances into weapons. Gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying across the room, thank you for this opportunity to finally restore honor to the Thorne name. But before he could continue, another figure stepped through the door behind him, shaking rain from her umbrella with the casual authority of someone who belonged anywhere she chose to be. Eleanor Ashford had arrived. She was still wearing the emerald dress from the morning, now dampened by rain, her hair coming loose from its pins. She looked like she'd run all the way from the police station, and perhaps she had. But her chin was high, her eyes clear, and when she spoke, her voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Forgive the interruption, gentlemen, but I believe you're about to make a decision based on incomplete information. And since that decision concerns my future husband, I thought I should ensure you have all the facts. Whitmore's face went white. Miss Ashford, this is highly irregular. You have no standing. I have every standing, she interrupted, moving to the center of the room. I'm the woman at the center of your accusations. Richard Ashford's daughter. The debt payments in question were made to creditors in my father's name. If Marcus Thorne is to be judged for his connection to me, then I believe I should be present for that judgment. She set her reticule on the table with a decisive thud, then drew from it a sheaf of papers that she began to lay out with the precision of someone who'd spent years organizing her father's chaotic affairs. You've been told a story today, Eleanor continued, addressing the board members directly. A story about a reckless man who manipulated a vulnerable woman, who misused company funds to assuage his guilt. It's a compelling narrative, simple, satisfying in its wickedness. She looked around the table, meeting each man's eyes. It's also incomplete. From her papers, she drew a document sealed with a solicitor's stamp. This is a copy of the authorization for those debt payments. You'll notice the signature. It matches Marcus Thorne's hand, yes. But look at the date. Whitmore leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. The dates on the payment authorizations were from 8 months ago, but the seal on Eleanor's document showed something different. This authorization, Eleanor said, was filed with my father's solicitor 3 years ago, before the railway investment, before the debts came due, before my father died. She let that sink in. It seems my father and the elder Mr. Thorne had an agreement, a private insurance, if you will. In the event that the railway investment failed and debts were called early, Marcus's father would ensure that certain personal obligations were met. My father's household debts, his membership fees, the small dignities that separate a gentleman's death from a pauper's. The room had gone silent, except for the rain against the windows. Marcus's father honored that agreement, Eleanor continued, but he did it quietly, through his son's accounts, perhaps to shield Marcus from the knowledge of his father's rare moment of conscience. Marcus didn't authorize those payments. He discovered them the same way you did, by accident, months after they occurred. This is absurd, Whitmore sputtered. A convenient document produced at exactly the right moment. Witnessed by 3 solicitors and filed with the probate court, Eleanor said calmly. I have copies of the court filing, dated and stamped. You may verify them yourselves. Richard Thorne stood, his face mottled with rage. And what of the engagement, the obvious manipulation? My nephew purchased this woman at auction like cattle. He did, Eleanor agreed, and her honesty shocked them into silence. He bought me because he was desperate, because his father's board demanded stability, because in a moment of panic, he thought a wife would solve his problems. She smiled then, sad and fierce. But that's not manipulation. That's just human foolishness. The kind every man in this room has been guilty of at some point in his life. She gathered her papers, sliding them back into her reticule. You can vote against Marcus if you choose. You can decide that a man who admits his mistakes is less worthy than one who hides them. But do it with clear eyes, gentlemen. Do it knowing that the alternative you're being offered is a man removed from this company for embezzlement, partnered with another who sees blackmail as a business strategy. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. And do it knowing that Marcus Thorne is still sitting in a police station, waiting to be allowed to defend himself. If that's the kind of integrity this company values, then perhaps it deserves what it gets. The door closed behind her, and the rain drummed on, and 12 men sat staring at papers that suddenly told a very different story than the one they'd thought they were reading. Back at the police station, Marcus was finally called into the inspector's office, where a tired-looking man in rumpled clothes reviewed the statement one final time before signing the release papers. You're free to go, Mr. Thorne. Seems the payments in question were authorized by your late father, all properly documented. Someone wasted our time today with false allegations. He looked up, and there was something like sympathy in his eyes. My advice? Be more careful about your enemies. The kind who'd use the law as a weapon aren't the kind who stop at one attempt. Marcus barely heard him. He was already moving, running through the station toward the street, knowing he was too late but unable to stop himself. The board meeting would be over. The vote taken. His future decided by men he'd never gotten to face. He burst onto the wet pavement and nearly collided with Eleanor standing in the rain, still as a statue staring up at the grey sky. Eleanor. She turned, and she was crying and laughing at the same time, a sound like relief and disbelief tangled together. I went, she said, to the meeting. I couldn't just wait, so I went. And I think Marcus, I think I may have saved us, or ruined us completely. Possibly both. He pulled her to him, not caring about the rain, or the people rushing past, or anything except the fact that she was here, solid and real in his arms. What did you do? Told them the truth, she said into his shoulder. All of it, every complicated, messy bit. And as they stood there in the rain, the church bells began to toll 5 o'clock. And somewhere across London, in an oak-panelled room full of powerful men, a vote was being counted that would determine whether truth was still worth something in a world built on appearances. Retry tea. They arrived at the Thorne Company headquarters just as the gas lamps were being lit along the street, each flame a small defiance against the gathering dusk. The building loomed above them, all stone and steel and the weight of generations, and Marcus felt Eleanor's hand tighten in his as they climbed the steps. The receptionist looked up with startled recognition. Mr. Thorne, sir, the meeting has concluded. The board members are still inside, but Marcus didn't wait for permission. He pushed through the mahogany doors with Eleanor beside him, their footsteps echoing through marble corridors that had witnessed a century of decisions, none of which had ever mattered quite as much as whatever had been decided in his absence. The boardroom door was closed. Voices murmured behind it, low and indistinct. Marcus raised his hand to knock, then hesitated, suspended in that terrible moment between not knowing and finding out. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd become, existed on one side of that door. What waited on the other could be his future or his ending. Eleanor's hand covered his. Together, they knocked. The conversation inside stopped. Footsteps approached. The door swung open to reveal Lord Whitmore, his face a careful mask, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been defeat or might have been rage held under glass. Marcus, he said, how punctual of you to arrive after everything's been decided. Then I suppose, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the way his heart was trying to break through his ribs. You won't mind if we come in to hear the results. The boardroom was thick with cigar smoke and tension. The 12 men sat around the table in various states of discomfort, their papers shuffled, their eyes not quite meeting Marcus's as he entered. His uncle Richard stood by the window, his back to the room, shoulders rigid with something that looked like defeat. At the head of the table, in the chair that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that, sat Thomas Aldridge, the oldest board member, a man who'd known Marcus since he was a boy stealing sweets from the company Christmas parties. Marcus, Aldridge said, his voice carrying the weight of years and difficult choices. Miss Ashford, please sit. They remained standing. Marcus couldn't have sat if his life depended on it, and perhaps it did in a way. Everything that made him who he'd become was bound up in this room, in what these men had decided about his worth. The vote, he said simply. Aldridge looked down at the paper before him, at whatever numbers were written there in ink that couldn't be changed. Before we get to that, I think you should know what happened here today, what was said, what was revealed. He glanced at Eleanor, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Your fiancé arrived during the deliberations, quite dramatically I might add, wet from the rain, determined as I've ever seen anyone. She had no right to be here, Whitmore interjected. No standing to address this board. And yet, another board member spoke up, a younger man named Collins who'd always been ambivalent about Marcus. She had information that changed everything. Documentation that proved the payment irregularities weren't fraud, but honor. A dead man's honor executed by his son. Marcus turned to Eleanor, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time all day. Not as his solution or his complication, but as the woman who'd walked into a room of powerful men who'd been prepared to destroy him and had simply told the truth until the truth was stronger than their prejudice. I didn't authorize those payments, Marcus said to the room. My father did years ago as part of a private agreement with Richard Ashford. I only discovered them when investigating today. But I would have authorized them if I'd known. I would have honored my father's commitment, even if it cost me everything in this room. Noble, his uncle said from the window, finally turning. Richard Thorne looked older than Marcus remembered, weathered by exile and bitterness. But nobility doesn't run empires, boy. Your father knew that. He built this company on hard choices and harder men, not on sentiment about dead investors and their orphaned daughters. Maybe that's why he felt guilty enough to make that agreement in the first place, Marcus replied. Maybe even he knew that some prices are too high to pay, even for success. Guilt is weakness. No. Marcus stepped forward, and his voice carried the certainty of someone who'd finally figured out what he believed. Guilt is what happens when you have a conscience. When you understand that other people aren't just pieces on your board, they're lives with value beyond what they can do for you. My father felt guilty because he should have. Because his decision to call those debts killed good men. And if I have to choose between being the kind of man who feels that guilt and the kind who doesn't, I choose guilt, every time. The silence that followed was profound. Even Whitmore seemed momentarily at a loss, his usual sharp retorts dying on his lips. Aldridge cleared his throat. The vote, he said, was complicated. We had to consider not just the allegations, but the response to them. The character revealed under pressure. He looked at Marcus, and his old eyes were sad. Your father was a great man, Marcus, but he was also a hard man. He believed the company came first, always. That personal feelings, personal costs, were acceptable sacrifices to the altar of success. I know, Marcus said quietly. He wanted you to be like him, to inherit not just his company, but his ruthlessness, his absolute dedication. Aldridge paused. But watching you today, hearing what you've said, seeing how you've conducted yourself through this entire ordeal, I think you've become something he never quite managed to be. What's that? Human, Aldridge said simply. Fallible and honest, and willing to admit when you're wrong. Willing to prioritize people over profit, at least occasionally. Your father would have thrown Miss Ashford to the wolves if it meant saving his position. He would have denied everything, destroyed evidence, crushed his enemies without mercy. He smiled then, tired but genuine. You didn't. You stood by her even when it would have been easier to cut ties. Even when it cost you everything. Marcus felt Eleanor's hand slip into his, her fingers cold but steady. So the vote, he said, hardly daring to hope. Aldridge lifted the paper. 7-5, with your Uncle Richard abstaining, citing conflict of interest once the documentation was produced. 7-5. Marcus's mind raced, trying to calculate what that meant, which direction the majority had fallen. 7 votes to keep him, 5 to remove, or 7 to remove, 5 to keep. His entire future balanced on that interpretation. 7 votes, Aldridge continued, and his voice was formal now, carrying the weight of official pronouncement, in favor of Marcus Thorne assuming full leadership of Thorne Company, effective immediately. The world tilted. Marcus heard Eleanor gasp beside him, felt her grip tighten until it was almost painful. 7-5. He'd won. By the slimmest margin possible, with everything hanging by a thread. But he'd won. However, Aldridge said, and that single word dropped like a stone into water, sending ripples through Marcus's relief. The vote came with conditions. First, that all financial decisions above £10,000 require board approval for the next 2 years. Second, that you submit to quarterly reviews of company operations. And third, he paused, looking between Marcus and Eleanor, that you be absolutely certain of your engagement to Miss Ashford. Because if this is still a charade, if this is still about appearances rather than commitment, then everything we decided today becomes meaningless. The board needs to know that the man leading this company is capable of genuine dedication. To people, not just profits. Marcus turned to Eleanor, seeing her in the lamplight. her dress still damp from rain, her hair falling in dark waves around her face, her eyes bright with tears and hope and fear all tangled together. The whole room was watching them. 12 men and his uncle and Lord Whitmore, all waiting for him to prove that what they'd built together was real. "When I bought you," Marcus said softly, speaking only to her, though everyone could hear, "I thought I was solving a problem. I thought you were a means to an end, a way to check a box and satisfy expectations. But I was wrong about nearly everything. You weren't the solution to my problem. You were the question I didn't know I needed to ask." "What question?" Eleanor whispered. "What kind of man do I want to be?" He touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Not my father's son, not the board's puppet. Just me, making choices I can live with, building something that matters. And the answer to that question, every time, in every way that counts, is the man who chose you. Not because I had to, not because it was strategic or beneficial or good for business, but because loving you is the first real thing I've ever done." A tear slipped down her cheek. "You're sure? Even now, after everything it's cost you? After Whitmore and your uncle and the police and nearly losing everything?" "Especially now," Marcus said, "because now I know what everything is worth, and it's not worth as much as you." She kissed him then, there in front of the board and God and everyone, and the room erupted in a mixture of applause and cleared throats and shuffling papers as men pretended they hadn't just witnessed something uncomfortably genuine. When they broke apart, Aldridge was smiling. "I think that answers the question of commitment. Congratulations, Marcus. The company is yours. Try not to bankrupt it with nobility." "No promises," Marcus said, and he was smiling too, giddy with relief and love and the strange lightness that came from having nothing left to prove. But Whitmore hadn't moved from his position by the door, and his face was a study in barely controlled fury. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You think you've won, but you've just made powerful enemies, the kind who don't forget." "Then they'll have something in common with me," Eleanor said, and her voice carried steel wrapped in silk. "Because I don't forget either, Lord Whitmore. I don't forget men who use other people's pain as weapons, who twist truth into lies and call it strategy. You tried to destroy Marcus because he threatened your position. You failed. And now you'll have to live in a company led by someone who actually has principles. I imagine that will be very uncomfortable for you." For a moment, Whitmore looked like he might respond, might lash out one final time. But something in Eleanor's gaze stopped him, some quality of absolute certainty that made further argument pointless. He gathered his papers, straightened his coat, and walked out without another word. Richard Thorne approached more slowly, his expression unreadable. He stopped before Marcus, studying him with eyes that held generations of complicated family history. "You're nothing like your father," he said finally. "Thank you," Marcus replied. His uncle's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "It wasn't meant as a compliment, but perhaps—" He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing. My brother built an empire, but he died alone, surrounded by wealth and devoid of warmth. If you can avoid that fate, maybe you'll have accomplished something he never did." He held out his hand. "Good luck, nephew. You'll need it." Marcus shook his hand, feeling the fragility of reconciliation, the tentative bridge being built across decades of resentment. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was possibility, and sometimes that was enough. As the board members filed out, offering congratulations or careful neutrality, depending on how they'd voted, Marcus and Eleanor stood together in the emptying room. The gas lamps flickered, casting dancing shadows across the mahogany table where so many decisions had been made, where his future had been decided by 7 votes instead of 5 going the other way. "We should go home," Eleanor said softly. "Home." The word settled over Marcus like a benediction. Not his father's house, Not the place where he'd lived alone with his ambitions and his fears, but home, the space they'd carved out together through honesty and stubbornness, and the strange alchemy of two broken people deciding to be whole together. They walked out into the London evening, where the rain had stopped and the air smelled clean, washed new. The street lamps were all lit now, a ribbon of light leading them forward into whatever came next. "I have something to tell you," Eleanor said as they walked. Marcus looked at her, seeing nervousness beneath her composed exterior. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about the cottage, the one you promised me, in the countryside, when this arrangement ended." She stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "I don't want it anymore." His heart stuttered. "Eleanor, I want to stay," she said quickly. "In London, with you. Not as part of an arrangement or an obligation, but as your actual wife. If you'll have me. If that's what you want too. If that's what I want." Marcus laughed, the sound carrying relief and disbelief and joy all tangled together. "Eleanor, I've been terrified you'd take the cottage and leave. That once you had your freedom, you'd realize how much better your life could be without the complications of being a Thorne. I don't want freedom from you," she said, and her voice was fierce with certainty. "I want freedom with you, the kind where we choose each other every day, not because we have to, but because we want to. Because we've seen the worst of what the world can throw at us and decided we're stronger facing it together." Marcus pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. Above them, stars were beginning to emerge through breaks in the clouds, small points of light against the vast darkness. The city moved around them, indifferent to their small drama. But here in this moment, they were the center of everything that mattered. "Marry me," he said into her hair. "Actually marry me, not for the board or appearances or strategy. Just because I love you and want to wake up beside you every morning for the rest of my life." "Yes," Eleanor said, and she was crying again, happy tears this time, the kind that came from finally believing the good things could last. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." They stood there as the evening deepened into night, two people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and somehow turned transaction into truth, arrangement into love. And though they couldn't know it yet, their story would become legend in the halls of Thorne Company, a reminder that sometimes the greatest successes came not from ruthless ambition, but from the courage to be vulnerably, impossibly human. Retry. 3 months later, spring arrived in London like a promise kept. The city bloomed with possibility, cherry trees scattering pink petals along the cobblestone streets, and Eleanor Thorne stood in the garden of what was now truly her home, watching Marcus through the window of his study as he worked. She'd taken to calling him that in her mind, Marcus. Not Mr. Thorne, not her husband, though he was both those things now. Just Marcus, the man who'd bought her compliance and somehow lost his heart in the exchange. The man who'd chosen her over an empire and gotten both in return, though not quite in the way he'd expected. The wedding had been small. No grand affair designed to impress investors or satisfy society's expectations. Just them and a handful of people who actually mattered, standing in a church older than the companies and conflicts that had brought them together. Eleanor had worn cream silk instead of white, a conscious choice that said this wasn't about innocence or beginnings, but about two people who'd already been through fire and chosen to build something from the ashes. Thomas Aldridge had attended, along with several board members who'd voted in Marcus's favor. Even Richard Thorne had appeared at the back of the church, sitting alone but present, his weathered face unreadable but not unkind. Whitmore had been notably absent, though rumors suggested he'd quietly resigned from the board and taken a position with a rival company in Manchester. Some battles, it seemed, were won simply by refusing to let bitterness consume everything good. Eleanor turned from the window and walked through the house they'd slowly been making theirs. The library where she still read at dawn, though now Marcus often joined her, the two of them discussing philosophy and politics over tea that had gone cold in its cups. The music room where she played piano while he pretended to work, but mostly just listened, his papers forgotten on his lap. The bedroom where they'd learned each other's rhythms and fears and the small intimacies that built a life together. In the hallway hung a new portrait, commissioned not by obligation, but by choice. In it, Eleanor and Marcus stood together, not in the formal poses demanded by tradition, but caught in a moment of genuine laughter, her hand on his arm, his eyes on her face. The artist had captured something true, and visitors to the house always paused before it, sensing the story behind the image even if they didn't know the details. She found Marcus in his study, surrounded by papers but staring out the window at nothing in particular. He looked up when she entered, his expression shifting from distraction to warmth in the way that still made her heart catch. "Escaping your responsibilities?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Contemplating them," he corrected. "There's a difference." "What are you contemplating?" Marcus leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "A proposal came in today, investment opportunity in a new railway line, coincidentally through the same region as my father's failed venture. The return would be substantial, the risk is minimal, all the surveys show solid ground. But the investors they want to bring in, several of them were ruined by the last attempt. Men who lost everything and spent years rebuilding." Eleanor understood immediately. "And you're wondering whether to involve them, whether giving them another chance at the wealth that destroyed them is mercy or cruelty." "Something like that." He smiled ruefully. "My father wouldn't have hesitated. He'd have seen only the opportunity, the profit potential. But I keep thinking about your father, about how one investment, one moment of hope, became the thing that killed him. So what will you do?" "I'm going to meet with them," Marcus said. "Each one, individually. Not as the man with the opportunity, but as the man whose family destroyed theirs the first time. I'm going to be honest about the risks and the history. And then I'm going to let them decide, with full knowledge of everything that could go wrong. No pressure, no manipulation, just information and choice." Eleanor crossed to him, perching on the edge of his desk. "You know that's not good business practice. That's not how empires are built." "No," Marcus agreed, pulling her closer. "But it's how I sleep at night, and I've discovered that's worth more than any empire." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting them both in gold. Outside, the city churned with commerce and ambition, people making the same choices that had always driven humanity forward, sometimes building and sometimes destroying in their wake. But here in this room, in this moment, two people who'd started as transaction had become something infinitely more valuable. "I've been thinking about the cottage," Eleanor said softly. Marcus tensed slightly. The cottage in the countryside had been her escape plan, her guarantee of freedom when the arrangement ended. That she'd never used it didn't mean it wasn't still there, still an option if she ever decided that being a Thorne was more burden than blessing. "We should keep it," she continued, "not as an escape, but as a reminder of who we were when we made those agreements, what we thought we needed versus what we actually discovered. And maybe someday when London becomes too much, we can go there together. Not to escape each other, but to escape the weight of everything else." "I'd like that," Marcus said, and his voice carried relief wrapped in understanding. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind that only comes when two people have learned to exist in each other's spaces without filling every gap with words. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily forward, measuring time that no longer felt like it was running out, but simply passing, moment by moment, toward a future they were building together. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "That night at the auction house. If you could go back, knowing everything that would happen, everything it would cost, would you still bid? Marcus considered the question seriously, the way he'd learned to consider everything now. Not with the quick calculation of profit and loss, but with the deeper arithmetic of what made a life worth living. I think, he said slowly, that we spend so much time trying to avoid the difficult paths that we forget they're often the only ones that lead anywhere worth going. That night at the auction house, I was trying to solve a problem with money. I thought I could buy stability, respectability, a future that looked like success from the outside. He touched her face, his thumb tracing the familiar line of her cheekbone. I didn't know I was actually buying a mirror that would force me to see who I really was underneath all the expectations and fear. And yes, that was painful, terrifying even. But it was also the best thing I've ever done. Even when Whitmore tried to destroy you, even when you almost lost everything. Especially then, Marcus said. Because that's when I learned what everything actually meant. And it wasn't the company, or my father's legacy, or the approval of men who don't matter. It was you, us. The life we're building where honesty costs more than lies but buys something infinitely more valuable. Eleanor leaned into his touch, feeling the truth of his words settle over her like a benediction. She thought about her own journey, from the humiliation of that auction platform to this moment, this place, this man who'd seen her at her lowest and somehow found worth she'd stopped believing in. I used to think, she said quietly, that being bought was the worst thing that could happen to me, that having a price put on my value would define me forever. But I was wrong. The worst thing would have been believing that's all I was worth, accepting the transaction as the whole story instead of just the terrible beginning. What changed? You did, Eleanor said simply, not because you saved me or rescued me from some terrible fate, but because you kept seeing me as more than what I represented, more than a solution or a complication or a debt paid. You kept asking what I wanted, what I thought, who I was underneath the role I was playing. And eventually, I started asking myself those same questions. Marcus pulled her fully into his lap, and she settled against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. The papers on his desk could wait. The decisions about railways and investments and the 1,000 other demands of running a company would still be there tomorrow. Right now, this was the only moment that mattered. I've been writing to the wives of some of those investors, Eleanor said, the ones your father ruined. Not to apologize exactly, because I can't undo what happened, but to acknowledge it, to offer help if they need it, connection if they want it. Some of them have replied, some haven't. But I needed to do it anyway. That's brave, Marcus said into her hair. That's necessary, Eleanor corrected. We can't change the past, but we can refuse to pretend it didn't happen. We can carry our history honestly instead of hiding from it. The evening was deepening outside, the garden filling with shadows and the soft calls of birds settling for the night. In a few hours they'd dress for dinner, maybe attend a social function or host friends in the drawing room. The ordinary rituals of a life lived in London's upper circles, though now with the knowledge that they were choosing it rather than being chosen by it. Do you think, Marcus asked, his voice contemplative, that love can really grow from something as transactional as what we started with? Or is what we have now something entirely different, built on the ruins of that arrangement? Eleanor considered the question, turning it over in her mind like a jewel examined for flaws. I think, she said finally, that it's both. The arrangement brought us together, put us in proximity long enough to see past the surfaces. But what grew wasn't because of the transaction, it was in spite of it. We fell in love not because we were supposed to, but because we couldn't help it. And maybe that's the real answer. Not whether love can come from transaction, but whether people can transcend their beginnings, whether we can be more than how we started. And can we? We are, Eleanor said with certainty. Every day, in every choice we make that honors what's real over what's convenient. We're proving that beginnings don't have to be endings, that the story you start with isn't always the story you end up living. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his arms tightening around her. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of truth earned through struggle. My father used to say that everything has a price, that the only question was whether you were willing to pay it. But I think he was wrong. Some things don't have prices because they're not for sale. And the most valuable parts of life are the ones we choose to give freely, without calculation or expectation of return. Like love, Eleanor said. Like love, Marcus agreed, which you can't buy no matter how much money you offer. You can only receive it as a gift if you're lucky enough to have someone offer it. They sat together as the room darkened around them, neither moving to light the lamps. The darkness felt comfortable, intimate, a space where they could simply exist without performance or pretense. This was the life they'd built from the wreckage of expectation and transaction, and it was more real, more valuable than anything either of them had imagined possible that night in the auction house. Eleanor thought about the question that had started this whole journey, the one that had hung unspoken between them through all the complications and revelations. Was it possible to buy a person's future and accidentally sell your own heart in the process? The answer, she'd learned, wasn't simple. Marcus had bought her compliance with money, her cooperation with security, her presence with the promise of freedom. But he hadn't bought her love, hadn't purchased her loyalty, couldn't have paid for the way she'd chosen him again and again, in moments when leaving would have been easier. Those things, the real things, the things that actually built a marriage worth having, she'd given freely. And in accepting them, Marcus had given something equally precious in return: his honesty, his vulnerability, his willingness to be changed by loving her. "We should probably light the lamps," Marcus murmured, though neither of them moved. "Probably," Eleanor agreed, equally still. But they stayed there in the gathering darkness, two people who'd learned that the most profound transformations happen not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the quiet accumulation of choices. In the decision to be honest when lying would be easier, to stay when leaving would hurt less, to build something real even when the foundation was cracked and uncertain. Outside, London settled into evening. Inside, Marcus and Eleanor Thorne held each other close and understood that they'd stumbled into something far more valuable than wealth or status or any of the things they'd thought they were chasing. They'd found the courage to be authentic in a world that rewarded pretense, to be vulnerable when armor was expected, to choose love when logic would have kept them safely separate. And perhaps that was the truest answer to any question about their story. Not whether you could buy compliance, or whether romance could flourish from transaction, but whether two people could look at the worst circumstances and the most cynical beginnings and decide to build something beautiful anyway. They had. They were. They would continue to. One honest choice at a time. The darkness was complete now, wrapping them in its velvet embrace. And in that darkness, two hearts beat in rhythm. No longer transaction and purchased good, no longer buyer and bought, but simply two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way and decided that how you start matters far less than how you choose to continue. That night, as they finally rose to light the lamps and return to the world of obligations and expectations, Eleanor paused at the door and looked back at Marcus. He was already watching her, his expression open in a way it never would have been at the beginning, when he'd been so carefully guarded, so determined to control everything. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For being brave enough to change. For letting me change you. For proving that people are always more than their worst moments or their most desperate choices." Marcus smiled, and it reached his eyes, transforming his face into something younger, lighter, unburdened by the weight of living up to impossible standards. Thank you for teaching me that compliance and love are nothing alike, and that the second is worth infinitely more than anything the first could buy. They walked together into the lamp-lit hallway, into the life they were building one day at a time, and the question that had started everything finally had its answer. He bought her compliance, but romance bought him instead. And in that mutual purchase, that exchange of things that couldn't actually be traded, but only given freely, they'd both found something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed: freedom. Not from each other, but with each other. The kind that only comes when two people decide that love is always a choice, never an obligation, and that the choices they make together matter more than any price that was ever paid. Retry.